All right, everyone, the drug war continues with continued nonsense about cannabis specifically. I'm going to look at this verbatim and read you out what was posted. And this was posted by Leighton Woodhouse. So he's the founder of Public, and he's been talking about this, I guess, in the past. I didn't know who this was before I saw this particular post. It's a Wall Street Journal piece, and the topic, Cannabis is linked to mental illness. A major new study shows that people who abuse the drug are more likely to be diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder. I do not dispute this. I would like to point out, though, that correlation does not equal causation. I think that it works backwards as far as the insinuation of cannabis causing mental illness. While it can be a trigger for latent underlying conditions, we do know this, and if you're smoking an enormous amount of marijuana, especially for an extended period, yeah, you can trigger yourself with that. It is possible at very high doses that you can have a psychotic break. This can happen with other drugs, including alcohol, which is perfectly legal and nobody has a problem with, by the way. But on this topic, I note, and he's saying, well, I'm not a fan of the drug war, but, and it's like, you get the insinuation. The problem is that this kind of study, and some of them are botched anyway, is exactly the sort of thing that we saw decades ago with gateway drug. Do you remember the term gateway drug? If you were a kid in the 90s, it still lingered on then. It was coined in the Reagan administration. And the idea was, okay, we're not claiming, because they had clearly lost the plot on marijuana because a lot of people smoked it. They understood that it wasn't that big a thing. The administration came and said, well, no, we're not saying that cannabis itself is the problem. It wouldn't be a big problem if people did smoke it, but it leads to using other drugs. Study after study more recently has shown, unequivocally, I've seen some of these, that in many cases, people that smoked weed and did other drugs smoked weed after they were already doing the harder stuff. They did it to cope with withdrawal symptoms. They did it to cope with nausea. They did it to cope with some of the negative impacts of their crack addiction or whatever, meth addiction. It would mellow out the symptoms, reduce the resulting withdrawal anxiety, etc., etc. They were effectively self-medicating. That's what, in many cases, not all, but many cases, is happening with mental illness. Now, normally the claim is that pot will cause schizophrenia. Schizophrenia will develop if you smoke pot. Of course, the methodology of the development of schizophrenia is not even fully understood, so any claim like that is spurious at best and speculative in nature. And now they're carrying it further. Now they're more likely to be diagnosed with depression and bipolar. So basically, marijuana causes a very, very wide spectrum of different disorders. What actually happens, because it's important to note what it says in the tagline, some people miss this, diagnosed with depression or bipolar disorder. That's a little bit different from it being caused by the marijuana. What's happening is that people who have depression anyway are smoking weed for their depression because weed has a tendency to take the edge off depression. For most people, it makes them giggly. It also helps with other things. Bipolar disorder. In some cases, it'll even out a person's mood. Marijuana is studied in a medical context for things like this. The insinuation is that the marijuana precedes the depression. So little Timmy was perfectly happy. He gets beat up by his dad and his mom's out at the bar every night, but he was so happy until he found marijuana, and all of a sudden the tears came to the surface. I doubt that. I think that it's more people self-medicating. The same is true of schizophrenics. Schizophrenics are more likely than other groups of people to smoke tobacco as well. When they're in that avoidant stage of schizophrenia, it's a lot of anxiety, so they smoke. It makes them feel a little better. It carries over now they're addicted, so it doesn't matter which phase they're in. They're more likely to smoke than other people. People with depression are more likely to drink, but the alcohol didn't usually cause the depression. Yes, it is possible with prolonged alcohol usage for a person's mood to become quite a bit lower. It can sink you into a depression. But in many cases, the person took up the bottle because of the depression. They weren't drinking when they first developed signs of it. Latent schizophrenia. Even prior to being diagnosed as a schizophrenic, a person can still have behavioral abnormalities under simply latent schizophrenia. It still causes personality change. Of course, the person is more likely, therefore, to use drugs. The unfortunate thing is that the drug warriors looked at this and said, well, I've noticed that a lot of these people who have psychotic breakdowns have been smoking weed prior or dropping acid or something. Acid madness was another thing. If you take acid, it'll drive you crazy. It'll burn holes in your brain and stuff. Well, they looked at the kind of people that were doing LSD and they noticed a correlation with eccentric, wild, erratic behavior. That's because those are the kind of people that were more likely to get into the areas where acid was more common, more frequently used. And then peer pressure kicks in and a million other things. So they used acid. I used acid, by the way. And look at me, I'm perfectly, totally normal. Well, at the very least, I'm sane. The drug war is full of propaganda. I would note that cannabis has been legal for a long time in some parts of the world, and I don't see a massive skyrocketing increase in mental illness in those countries. I happen to be in one of them. The Netherlands, Amsterdam coffee shops have been open for quite some time. They've had weed and more recently magic mushrooms available for a long time. Despite that fact, mushrooms are widely available, but I don't see people jumping off buildings at higher rates than they do in the puritanical United States. People smoke weed. I don't see a massive amount of addiction to it. Like, I think I smelled weed far more often in Burlington, walking down the street than I do here. And that was back when it was still illegal in Vermont. We're talking the 2000s. You would smell weed more often there. Or driving down the street in Rutland. You drive past somebody and there's a cloud coming out of the side of their car. It was basically a gray area legally. The cops really didn't give a fuck about it unless you had bales of marijuana or something. I remember actually our suite mates the first year were found with several bales of marijuana in their dorm room. They got raided during a break, I think, that I was on. And I came back to that story, and then the other suite was empty. There's one time in which they left a shit ton of filters, I guess for some sort of purpose, weed-related. I'm not exactly sure what they were. They were like little cotton wedges or something like that. And they had tracked them all the way to the entrance of the building through the elevator and all the way to their door room. And it's like, you just left a trail of breadcrumbs. If some hall monitor does want to complain, they do have now a legitimate reason to do so. Somebody's going to come knocking. You should hope that they don't have a badge on at the time. And they were, by the way, terrible suite mates. They vomited all over the bathroom, never cleaned it up. I literally had to clean up their vomit on 2 different occasions. They were assholes, basically. I think they got kicked out. Good riddance. The drug war is off the chain, though. The fact is that the average person smoking weed is not actually smoking enormous quantities of it. They're toking sometimes. There are people that are habituated. Yes, it can cause problems in their life. It also can be an expensive habit depending on what kind of weed you're smoking. I keep hearing as well, and this is mentioned in the replies thread, well, weed today is not the same as it was back in the golden age of Acapulco Gold. It's got more THC in it. Okay, well then there's an easy solution. Smoke less of it. Instead of cleaning the bowl, take a hit or 2. Problem solved. Yeah, the youngin' might think, well, it's my first time, I'm going to smoke this whole bowl. Okay, and then they get greened out or something. That's fine. They're also more likely to guzzle alcohol instead in a binge and puke all over themselves. But we don't say, hey, 21-year-old's not allowed to buy beer. We don't do that. Oh, but alcohol these days is different. Whiskey is so much stronger than beer. Okay, well, you generally don't drink it the same way you do beer. So that's bullshit. As far as the THC content of marijuana is concerned, it just saves you money. I think that that's probably a good thing rather than a bad thing. That's about all. Peace out.